When you work the night shift, you expect everything to be normal, but these stories prove that horror can lurk anywhere. I was 20 years old when this strange incident happened, at the beginning of my career, when I started working at a small pizza restaurant. The restaurant was in a quiet residential area, far from the noise of the city. Although the place wasn't fancy, my salary was good compared to some other places. I usually worked evening shifts, starting at 7 p.m. and ending at midnight, where I was mostly busy preparing food or delivering orders to customers around the city. That night was one of the ordinary nights at work. The restaurant wasn't crowded, and the atmosphere was calm. The clock showed 10 p.m. and there was a new order to deliver to a neighborhood far from the city center. After preparing the food, I took the order and gathered the other supplies, then got into my car to deliver the pizza. The road was long, and I knew it would take me about 20 minutes to reach the destination. As the road became more isolated, I started feeling a sense of anxiety creeping over me. The lights were dim, the roads were almost empty of vehicles, and the night had begun to envelop the area in a strange way. The trees on both sides of the road were dense, blocking the light from reaching the road naturally. Still, I was used to working in similar areas, so these were just minor details. I finally arrived at the address and found the house at the end of a dark road, surrounded by a high wooden fence. It looked like a very old house, 2 stories, with a large garden full of overgrown grass and tangled plants. Something about this place made me feel uneasy. The front facade was dark, with no lights coming from the windows. The house had an old, abandoned vibe, though there was nothing to suggest it was completely deserted. I parked my car in front of the dark entrance and took a deep breath to calm myself. I walked quickly toward the front door, and at that moment, I noticed that the door was open in an unusual way. It wasn't just slightly ajar, it was wide open. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to pull myself together, thinking to myself that maybe they had left it open for some reason. As I approached the door, I heard a soft voice from inside saying, "Hello, can you bring the food inside? I'm just setting up the table." The voice sounded friendly, but at the same time it was strange. It didn't carry any threat, but it had an odd tone that made me hesitate for a moment. I decided to proceed, but every step I took inside the house increased my anxiety. The house was dark and everything was eerily quiet, as if time had stopped there. Nothing was moving and everything was in its place, as if it had been left in the middle of an event. No sounds, no movement, just a strange emptiness. Even though I had heard the voice, there was no trace of the person who had spoken. I walked down the hallway and placed the food on the table in the kitchen. The place was completely empty. The air was cold, and the light in the room was very faint, to the point where I felt like I was in a deserted place. Even though I was sure someone had been there, I couldn't quite make sense of it. But just as I was planning to head back outside, I heard the same voice again, this time coming from another hallway in the house. "Can you bring the food here, please?" The voice was coming from a completely dark room, and when I looked, the room behind the slanted door was filled with utter darkness. I even felt a chill run through my body. There was no trace of light in that room, as if the darkness was covering the place in a strange way. I felt something unnatural, as if I was in an unfamiliar place. My eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign that would reassure me that this place wasn't strange. I didn't know what to do at that moment, but something was urging me to leave quickly. I felt something odd in the dark room, as if entering it might mean I wouldn't return the same. I quickly left the food and ran outside without looking back. As soon as I reached the car, I felt a tightness in my chest, and my heart was pounding. My hands were trembling as I put the key in the ignition and quickly closed the door behind me. I drove back to the restaurant, thinking about every moment of that visit. When I got back to the restaurant, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I felt that no one would believe me, and they might think I was imagining things. It was better to keep what I had experienced to myself, but the more I thought about that incident, the more I felt I had done the right thing. At that moment, I had made the right decision to leave that house before something irreversible could happen. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the video to support us in continuing to publish stories. And don't forget to tell us your stories in the comments so we can show them in an upcoming video. I was 20 years old when I started my first job at a local pizza place in a quiet neighborhood. It was my first part-time job while I was studying at university, and I didn't know much about how to deal with customers or how to deliver orders, but I needed the money and was happy to have gotten the job. The restaurant was very simple and didn't offer anything extraordinary, but it provided me with a decent income. We worked evening shifts starting at 8 p.m. and lasting until midnight, and sometimes until 1 a.m. That night was one of the ordinary nights at work. The atmosphere in the restaurant was calm, and everyone was working in silence as usual. I was arranging food for the orders that came from customers who often ordered pizza late at night. Until 11 p.m., nothing unusual had happened, and the restaurant was free of crowds. It was very cold, and the dim lighting made the place feel even more isolated. At 11:10 p.m., a new delivery order came in. It was a large order containing 3 types of pizza with some appetizers. The address was in a remote area outside the city, near the suburbs, in a neighborhood I had delivered to before. It was about 20 minutes away from the restaurant, but I wasn't worried about the distance. In fact, the road to this neighborhood was lined with tall trees and luxurious houses that always intrigued me. However, the atmosphere that night felt strange. There was something unfamiliar in the air, like a coldness enveloping the place. Even though I had delivered many orders to this neighborhood, I felt something odd at that moment, something I couldn't quite pinpoint. I got into my car and started driving down the narrow road leading to the neighborhood. The trees on both sides of the road were very dense, making the night seem even darker. At times, I felt like I was approaching a distant place where no one ever went. Everything was extremely quiet. No sounds of cars, not even the movement of nocturnal animals. Everything seemed still, as if time had stopped in this area. As I drove, I thought about how to deliver the order quickly and return to the restaurant, but I began to notice something strange. The streets were almost empty, and the house I was heading to was located at the far end of the neighborhood. There were no streetlights and nothing indicated the presence of life in the area, but I continued driving anyway. When I arrived at the address, I saw the house I was heading to. It was set back from the road, surrounded by a high wooden fence, and the path to it was completely dark. As I approached the entrance, I felt a strange sensation in my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but I felt something unnatural about this place. I observed the house, which looked very old, with 2 stories and dusty walls that seemed untouched for decades. The windows were completely dark, and I couldn't see anything inside the house. I parked my car a few steps away from the front door. I looked at the place for a few moments, then got out of the car and grabbed the order. The air was very cold, and the wind carried the sounds of trees swaying in the breeze. I tried to focus on the task, but something was stirring unease within me. It felt like I was in a strange place. I reached the front door and found it partially open. It wasn't just slightly ajar, it was almost wide open. I approached the door, and at that moment I heard a voice from inside saying, "Hello, can you bring the pizza inside? I'm just setting up the table." The voice was friendly, but there was a strange tone to it. I couldn't quite figure out what made me feel uncomfortable. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to proceed. After all, it was just a simple task, and it would be over quickly. I entered the house, and the further I went, the more my tension grew. The inside of the house was dark, and the lights were very dim, as if no one had turned them on in a long time. The rooms were filled with very old furniture, and the walls were covered in stains that suggested they hadn't been cleaned in years. I wondered to myself why there were no lights in this house. I headed straight to the kitchen and placed the pizza on the table. The moment I put the food down, I felt something strange. There was no one in the room. I didn't hear any movement, not even a breath. The more I looked around, the more discomfort I felt. The house was so quiet that it felt like I was in a deserted place, even though I was sure I had heard the voice asking me to bring the pizza. Then, in a moment, I heard the same voice again. "Can you bring the pizza here, please?" The voice came from a dark hallway on the opposite side. Although I couldn't see anything, the voice seemed to come from a distant place, and it carried a warm tone. But there was no movement in the area. Suddenly I felt an intense coldness in the room, and my body began to shiver. I tried to quickly return to the front door, but I felt like I couldn't move. Every step I took was filled with uncomfortable tension. I quickly looked around and saw the closed door leading to that dark room. I couldn't bear to stay any longer. I ran to the front door as if I could no longer endure being in that place. Ran to my car as fast as I could and got in without looking back. I felt like I was on the verge of losing control. I kept thinking about what had just happened, wondering about the truth behind that voice. When I returned to the restaurant, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I felt like they wouldn't believe me and might even laugh at me. But in the days that followed, those memories kept coming back to me. Every time I thought about that dark room and remembered that voice, I felt something strange in my stomach. I believed I had made the right decision by leaving, but I still wondered about the nature of that voice. Maybe I wasn't the only one in that house that night. I was just shy of 22 years old when I started working at a small, family-owned takeout restaurant run by my parents. The restaurant was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where the lights outside barely lit up the sidewalk at night. My parents were incredibly supportive of my college schedule, and they allowed me to take night shifts so I could manage both school and work. While the restaurant itself wasn't glamorous, serving quick meals and takeout orders, it was our pride and joy. Most of my shifts involved cleaning up after hours and occasionally helping out with cooking or preparing orders when things got busy. It was a chilly November evening when something happened that I'll never forget. The kind of night where you could see your breath in the air and the streets outside were eerily quiet. It was already past 9 p.m. and I was finishing up my cleaning routine when I noticed something odd. A car had pulled into the parking lot. The lot was always empty at that hour, and this car seemed out of place. The small lot didn't usually see many customers at night, especially when it was this cold. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a customer stopping by quickly. But after about 20 minutes, the car hadn't moved and nobody had entered the restaurant. It made me curious, so I glanced out the window a few times. There it was, a faded red sedan parked at the far end of the lot, the engine still running but no one around. After a while, it simply drove off, leaving the parking lot as empty as before. I shrugged it off, continuing with my tasks, but something about the incident left a nagging feeling in my stomach. The next evening, I returned to work, trying to put the strange occurrence behind me. But, like clockwork, the same car appeared again, right around the same time. I could see it clearly from the large windows in the front. The headlights were blaring, and it was facing the restaurant, parked directly across from the entrance. The car had tinted windows, and it sat motionless, as if waiting for something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it, but something about the situation felt off. I checked the locks on the doors again, just to be sure, and resumed my work. but my thoughts kept drifting back to the car outside. My instincts were telling me that something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the anxiety creeping up my spine. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that maybe I was overthinking it, but a feeling of dread lingered in the air. By the time I finished up for the night, I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I walked to my car in the empty parking lot, and for a split second, I felt like someone was watching me. The car from last night had disappeared, but its presence had left a lingering unease. I decided to take the next night off, thinking that maybe a break would clear my head and help me focus on my studies. When I returned 2 nights later, my nerves were on edge. I kept glancing outside, half expecting to see the same red sedan again, but it didn't show up. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. I finished my shift without any further incidents, locked the doors tightly, and started my walk to my car, the cold air biting at my cheeks. Then, as I reached the parking lot, that familiar feeling of unease hit me again. The lot, which had been empty just moments before, now had a car parked in the far corner, barely visible in the darkness. I froze for a second, unsure of what to do. The car wasn't the same as before, but something about it still set my nerves on edge. It had no lights on, and it seemed to be watching me. Just as I reached my own car, the engine of the dark car roared to life, and its headlights flashed on. In an instant, the car was speeding toward me. Panic surged through me as I sprinted toward my car, fumbling for the keys. The sound of tires screeching on the pavement was deafening, and I could feel the car getting closer, almost as if it were chasing me. I barely managed to get into my car before the other vehicle pulled up right next to me. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I tried to start the engine. Before I could even react, the doors of the other car swung open, and I could see dark figures moving toward me. My mind went blank. I didn't even look at them. I just slammed the car into gear and floored the gas pedal. I sped down the dark road, my thoughts racing. What had just happened? Who were they? Why were they after me? The adrenaline surged through my veins, but I kept my focus. I knew I had to get out of there. My car screeched around corners and sped down the street until I reached a nearby gas station. I pulled into the well-lit area, my hands still shaking, and immediately called the police. I explained everything in a rush, feeling like I had narrowly escaped something worse. The police arrived soon after, but there wasn't much they could do. The restaurant didn't have any security cameras, and the only description I could provide was that the men had been wearing dark clothing, their faces covered. I couldn't even make out their features. They asked me if I had any enemies, or if there was anyone who might want to harm me, but I didn't know anyone who fit that description. I was just a college student working at a small family restaurant. Nothing in my life suggested that something like this could happen. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't shake the images of those masked men, and every time I walked to my car, I felt a pang of fear. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking over my shoulder and glancing around corners. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. My parents, seeing how shaken I was, agreed that we needed to take action. We decided to install security cameras around the restaurant, and we increased the lighting in the parking lot, hoping to make it less inviting for anyone who might have ill intentions. We also started closing an hour earlier than usual to reduce the chances of something happening again. I was still scared, but at least I felt like I had more control over my environment.